about this week's Wave Rewind, and this one's called The Endless Wait. One of the things that I really think is important to note is this one highlights the birthday, I guess you could say, or anniversary of the Second Street Bridge, which was on October 31st, 1929. That's when the bridge opened. They started construction in September of 1926. But I want you to follow the dates in this Wave Rewind because it's super important to note. The Great Depression happened right before they opened the bridge, and everybody was still super excited to see the economic growth that the city was ready to welcome. But things take a turn in a month when November hits. So just follow along in this first segment, and this is called The Endless Wait.
October 31st, 1929. The biggest show in town was the opening of the new municipal bridge at the foot of 2nd Street. The city was proud. The $5 million bridge was proof that Louisville's industrial expansion of the 1920s had succeeded. President Hoover had come down a few days before to inspect with some of his cronies. And now Mayor William Harrison was hailing the event.
An epic in Louisville's history of progress begins today. This is a dream realized. Louisville is growing in size and in commercial importance. We enjoy the greatest prosperity that we have ever known, and an even greater future lies ahead. Poverty will be banished in this decade by our expanding markets.
Louisville in the 1920s was a place where American business values of personal initiative, aggressive promotion, and hard work counted. The city had grown to 29th in size in the nation, and many had found in the prosperity of the city a dream come true. For those represented on the platform that day, the city's elite businessmen, there was a pot of gold at the end of every rainbow. A 20% increase in business was expected every year. But for most of the crowd, blue-collar and white-collar workers, it was different. They had jobs, but they had not yet experienced the good life which was promised. They were waiting for what would soon be theirs. The bridge was bound to bring a new flow of business into the city. But the day before the bridge had opened, something unforeseen had happened which the music and the speeches could not cover up. The stock market had crashed in New York, and it sent a chill over everyone in the crowd. The bridge was supposed to bring the prosperity and money of the nation closer. But now, would it bring these new problems closer too? At first, there were no signs that the stock market crash had changed anything in Louisville. The brisk pace of 4th Street with its traffic and busy shops was reassurance that everything was all right here. The sounds and sights of prosperity were everywhere. The city had always taken pride in the essential stability of its locally owned businesses, and business was saying there was no need to worry. They talked up the city. One reason for the city's stability was not only the locally owned business, but also that hiring was often done on a family basis. You could almost always get a job if you had an uncle or a cousin on the payroll. But by mid-1930, that was not enough. There were beginning to be cutbacks at plants like American Standard Sanitary and Vogt Manufacturing. Orders were not coming in like they used to. Locally, they attributed it to the fact that building starts were down 45% since the beginning of the year. But there were much more serious reasons. There was a pattern developing throughout the country. Factory closings, people being wiped out, suicides. It was as if, far, far away, a process had been set in motion, and now it was beginning to reach Louisville. Money sources were drying up. Loan companies calling in their loans. People nervously pulling out their savings. Shops seemed empty. So still. It was a strange, eerie feeling. People wondering, waiting, as if they were about to see an event which had never taken place in the city before. Then, on November 16, 1930, the axe fell. The Depression hit Louisville. The Bank of Kentucky, the largest in the city and in the South, the keystone of Louisville's economy with assets of $50 million, closed. And in its wake, 5 other local banks announced their closings. There had been runs on the banks still open, people waiting in line to draw out their money, fearful that there would be nothing there when they reached the teller's window. Black Monday was the single biggest financial disaster which the city had ever faced. In the next 3 years, Louisville's unemployment would rise as high as 34%, 1/3 of the workforce of the city unable to find work. The growing fear and insecurity of the nation would touch every fiber of the city. It was certain and unavoidable that Louisville was in for it. Republican Mayor William Harrison had come into office in the heyday of the 20s. But now he realized that the job would be more than the ceremonies of the office. Harrison put strong trust in Louisville's reputation for compassion and generosity. The city had always been able and wanted to take care of its own problems. There was a dedication to provide for those in need, usually found only in small towns and rural areas. Neighbors looked out for each other. It was common for families to feed and house not only needy relatives and friends, but even total strangers. That strong feeling of personal moral responsibility was found almost universally in Louisville's many churches. In addition to taking care of clothing, medical, and financial needs, thousands of food baskets were personally delivered by church members, especially during the holidays. But these personal efforts were not enough. The city had to count heavily on its community chest program to provide for needs on a citywide basis. As the crisis grew, citizens felt a responsibility to increase the goal even though they had less to give, and each year the goal was met. The city knew how important it was. Despite mounting unemployment, the Republican mayor and the city's business leadership reaffirmed their belief that free enterprise could get the city back on its feet. They needed no outside help. The system had worked before, and it could work now. Business-like measures were needed, so the mayor led the way with a 10% salary cut for all city employees and managed to balance the budget while at the same time doubling and then quadrupling the amount given to unemployment relief by the city. Now the word depression was used openly. They had to meet the challenge. Together, the mayor and business leaders organized a campaign to get the unemployed back to work. They asked all unemployed persons to register with the city. 6,000 lined up the first day. Certainly, there were many, many more. The city's response was the Man a Block program. People in every block in the city were canvassed to see if they were willing to give some kind of manual work, odd jobs, anything to the unemployed. Highly skilled people washed windows and mowed lawns and were glad for the chance to work. Jobs paid 30 cents an hour, and many were helped that way temporarily. They felt that any job was better than no job at all. There were innumerable fundraising benefits. The Board of Trade put on an air circus at Bowman Field, which made almost $10,000 for unemployment relief. Louisville did better in raising this kind of money than either Chicago or Cleveland. The community had really pulled together, and many believed that by pulling a little harder, they could make it.
Okay, so the last thing you just heard there was that Louisville did better than other cities like Chicago and Cleveland. And I really wanted to find the specific numbers, and I couldn't really find anything on that. But Chicago was built on manufacturing. So in the next segment that you're going to see, you're going to understand how Louisville was able to recover differently than those other places. But I also wanted you guys to note that those odd jobs that people were able to do, they said it was 30 cents per hour, which would equal, when you add in inflation, about $5.54. So still under the federal minimum wage, but just think of what those little odd jobs meant for people who were unemployed. So in this next segment, you're going to see the impact that the Great Depression had on families. You'll learn about interest rates and what people did to keep up appearances that they had a job. So we're going to just take a quick little break, and then we'll join you right back so that you can see the second segment of The Endless Wait. All right, welcome back. So, just to recap for anyone who is joining us, this Wave Rewind is called The Endless Wait. And the best way that I can describe it is looking at the milestones in Louisville's history, and that is the good and the bad. And when I say the bad, I'm talking about when the Great Depression hit, because this episode started with the opening of the Second Street Bridge, which we know many people drive on, and it was a big moment in Louisville's history. But days before it was when the Great Depression happened. So I want you to understand the timeline. The Great Depression in Louisville lasted from 1929 to about 1939. So you have October 28th, 1929, when the stock market crashes, October 30th, 1929, when the Second Street Bridge opens, and then about November 16th of the same year is when the Depression hits Louisville. And then this is getting into what you're going to see in a minute, which is about when the Great Flood of 1937 happened. So that's going to be a little bit later on, but you'll also see, I think the best way to describe Louisville overall is resilient. And this next segment explains a little bit of why.
But by 1932, the situation was clearly out of control. Total salaries for the city were half what they had been in 1929. Interest rates were skyrocketing. Building starts were down 400% from 1929. Food prices were dropping, but still few families could afford to buy more than the essentials. The small neighborhood grocery, which had always provided credit, could no longer do so. Many people were having to shop for one meal at a time. Half a dozen eggs, a few apples or potatoes. One cutback seemed to lead to another and created a feeling of helplessness. A few jobs were available, but only on a temporary basis. Many lined up each day at the factories at the crack of dawn and waited, hoping to be among the lucky few picked by the foreman. But no one complained. The reaction was one of calmness. There was little you could do about it anyway.
Be optimistic, don't you be a grumpy. When the road gets bumpy, just smile, smile and be happy. Your troubles can't be as bad as all that when you're sad and all that. No one loves you. Be optimistic, don't you be a mourner. Brighten up that corner and smile. Don't wear a long face, it's never in style. Be optimistic and smile. Be optimistic.
Probably what kept Louisville's head above water was the unexpected upturn in the sale of tobacco. Cigarette smoking had increased 20 times what it had been in 1928, and Louisville had a product which the whole nation wanted.
Be optimistic and smile.
Sales of 3.2 beer were also rising dramatically to the benefit of Louisville's old German breweries. So much so that a local brewery, Ertles, could advertise the life-sustaining powers of its product. The need for a hero ran deep. The Depression was severely weakening what people saw in themselves. The struggle just to get by was straining self-respect, especially for the older men who had been laid off work. They had nowhere to go, and they had so much pride.
Poverty will be banished in this decade.
They would get dressed for work and go downtown just as though they had paying jobs. Their neighbors never knew that they were out of work. They would sit in the bus station all day or in a cafeteria drinking coffee.
An epoch in Louisville's history of progress begins today.
They blamed themselves so much for their hard luck and misfortune. They had such a low opinion of themselves. They just hadn't been able to make it. But unemployment not only destroyed pride, it also brought with it a kind of paralysis of the spirit. Even for those with jobs, there was an inner fear that it could all end, that there was nothing which was absolutely secure, that you could discover the next day that you had been replaced because there was always someone waiting in line to take your job. Employees looked around the office nervously. 12 million people were unemployed in the United States. President Hoover was leaving office a thoroughly discouraged man. He had tried everything in his power to stimulate the economy and had failed. He was at the end of his rope. That Republican business optimism about the future with which he had entered office was gone forever. During the fall of 1932, Franklin Roosevelt stopped in Louisville during his presidential campaign. There was excitement in the streets. He was recognized as a new hope for the city and the country. And Roosevelt had a special interest in Louisville because one of his major contributors was Robert W. Bingham, owner of the Courier-Journal, whom Roosevelt made his first ambassador to England. Within months, he had won, and the city was parading down Main Street for the President's National Recovery Act, the NRA. Louisville businesses went all out to support the program, responding to Roosevelt's request not to raise prices and to use more workers for shorter hours in order to get the economy going again. The business leaders canvassed 6,000 businesses in the community to win support. The old Louisville combination of patriotism and money came forward again, but now business realized this was their only hope.
There is no magic formula, no economic panacea, which could simply revive overnight, for example, the heavy industries and the trades that are dependent upon them. Private enterprise in times such as these cannot be left without a system. and without reasonable safeguards, lest it destroy not only itself, but also our processes of civilization.
On the strength of the Roosevelt surge, Louisville got its first Democratic mayor in years, Neville Miller, who soon came to be known as the New Deal mayor. There was a new development in the city which had never taken place before. Money from the federal government began pouring into the city. $5 million worth of jobs and buildings. The PWA, the WPA, and other federal programs brought the building of new schools, medical facilities, and roads on a scale Louisville had never known. Louisville had more public housing built than any other city of its size in the country. There were 350 miles of streets paved in the city and county. There was job training for black people, something that had hardly ever existed in the city before. The president had managed to give a new sense of self-confidence to the nation and to the city, and by the end of 1933, relief rolls in Louisville were cut back dramatically. The New Deal had created more than 28,000 jobs in the state, a significant proportion of them here. But private business was beginning to recover as well. The repeal of Prohibition had a special meaning to Louisville with its whiskey industry. The celebration was for more than just the drinks. By 1936, there was a new confidence. Once again, the good life seemed almost within reach. And many, with a sigh of relief, could begin to enjoy the Crescent Hill swimming pool without the old worries. The long-range problems of the Depression in Louisville were still present. But the main change was that the president had succeeded in giving a fragile sense of security to the men and women who had been thrown out of work. To these people who had suffered the most, the blue and white collar worker, the forgotten man as the president called them, Roosevelt was a miracle worker.
I'm happy to report that after years of uncertainty, we are bringing order out of the old chaos with a greater certainty of the employment of labor at a reasonable wage. For the emergency purpose of the NRA was to put men to work. And since its creation, millions of hitherto underprivileged workers are today far better paid than ever before. The gain has been substantial, and everybody knows it.
But the sense of security which the New Deal brought to the city was not to last.
Okay, so we just got to see Louisville building and then crash down just a little bit during the Great Depression. And I say that lightly because I keep using the word resilient to describe the city during this time, because there was so much hope still, especially when you look at Roosevelt bringing in that wave of hope with the New Deal. But let's also just say, did you recognize some familiar faces and names? Like the Bingham, this is what makes Wave Rewind so special, is we get to really see the origin story of so many different businesses in Louisville. Maybe you're noticing some of the names on buildings when they're popping up on the screen. So we're going to take another break, but this next segment, it's going to talk about the Great Flood of 1937. And you get to see how when you add all of the economic disparity with what was going on, and then you add the flooding on top of that, it really did bring Louisville down. But you'll see, just like any year, Derby was the light at the end of the tunnel. So stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, so now our last and final segment in this Wave Rewind called the Endless Wait. Just to recap what you've already learned, the Great Depression hit right before the Second Street Bridge opened, which just want to say is about to turn 96 years old. And then we get to see what the Depression looks like when it hit Louisville. And we are starting to see some rebuilding efforts. But this next segment is going to cover the Great Flood of 1937. And when you think about the amount of rainfall that we've seen, like when the flooding happened earlier this year, bless their hearts, it was nothing compared to what you're about to see in this coverage. So stay with us because this is the last segment in this week's Wave Rewind, the Endless Wait.
In the January cold of 1937, it started raining. 2 weeks later, it had not stopped. 19 inches of rain had fallen on top of snow. The river was rising at the rate of 4 inches an hour. As the water still continued to rise, people were abandoning their homes, getting out with whatever they could carry. Some left the city altogether. Once again, Louisville was face to face with catastrophe. 40% of the city was underwater, 200,000 homeless. President Roosevelt declared Louisville a national disaster area and sent troops to patrol the city. 500 WPA workers were brought in to fill sandbags. The water had come as far as the east end of Broadway, which was a mill race with a strong current down the middle. But the west end was worse. There, the river had risen over 50 feet. People found themselves stranded and helpless with little heat or food. But a vast rescue operation was organized by the mayor to deal with the problem. Cooperation and immediate action to help came naturally, but this would stretch the city to its limits. They worked day and night, rescuing 100 families an hour. With telephones mostly out, the principal line of communication was WHAS radio, which relayed more than 10,000 calls for help. Food and shelter had to be found for thousands. The refugees were relocated in schools and churches in the high parts of the city not flooded. A pontoon bridge made of whiskey barrels was built over Baxter Avenue, a fragile link to keep the city moving. Now the life of the city was geared only to survival. With no industry, no business, little transportation, and finally no source of electricity when the hydro plant went out and the city was plunged into darkness. All supplies had to be brought in by boat. And in some cases, the boats that brought in the supplies were used to carry out the dead. Miraculously, only 200 died. The water had crested at 57 feet on January 27th and was on the way down. But the danger was far from over. With the sewers backed up, there was the constant threat of epidemic. They set up impromptu health stations to vaccinate the whole city for typhoid. There were precautions for the worst that might come, including digging a mass grave in Cave Hill. Later came the threat of fire from the oil and gasoline on top of the water. The worst fears were realized when the Louisville Varnish Company plant caught on fire, sending out flames over the oily waters in all directions and threatening parts of the city. But the fire was contained. As the water receded, the extent of the damage became painfully clear. The muddy Ohio had penetrated into every corner and closet of nearly half the city, all the West End and downtown, leaving behind a worthless mess. The river had receded, but much of the floodwater was left behind in the basements and cellars of the city. It was a slow and hard process for some. As citizens returned, they surveyed their ruined homes and belongings. Damage was estimated at $100 million. The city began the process of sifting through the mess, trying to recover what little was still salvageable. The tobacco warehouses were especially hard hit. The simplest solution for the tons and tons of rubbish was to dump it. From the very same bridge which had been dedicated to Louisville's dream of prosperity only 8 years before. Now it was hardly a place from which to consider the future. Prosperity seemed more elusive than ever. Even the fragile security which Roosevelt and the New Deal had given now seemed gone and vanished. For many, it must have seemed that nothing had changed. Once more, there were long lines of people, hungry and helpless. They gathered what fuel they could and stood in the wet and cold, waiting. It brought back the old feelings of uncertainty and fear of a few short years before, which they had only just managed to forget. Surely, for some, any hope of the future must have seemed useless. But within only 4 months, the city was celebrating the 63rd running of the Kentucky Derby with the 3rd annual Derby Festival. They were back on their feet by their own efforts and in record time. They knew they could do it. But the scars of 7 years of crisis and struggle could not be banished by decree of the King and Queen of the Derby. With time, the memories of those hard times would fade, but would never entirely disappear. The endless wait for prosperity would leave its mark on a whole generation.
All right. So there are so many different points, especially in that last segment. It felt like it was really full circle when you think about how the endless wait started, when we see the opening of the 2nd Street Bridge, to see it being used for them to throw goods off the sides of it because of all the things that were damaged after the flood. And then to, like all good things here in Louisville, to cap it off with the Kentucky Derby just feels like a true Louisville story. So we got to see Louisville growing, Louisville down a little bit. And then, like we always say, there's always that light at the end of the tunnel. But for us, we call that Derby. I would love to know, what was your favorite moment in this week's Wave Rewind? Was it seeing people paddling across Broadway, or was it, seeing the different industries impacted? I was shocked to learn about Louisville's place with the tobacco industry. So would love to hear what your favorite moment was, or what you learned. Maybe you recognize someone. So whatever it is, we would love for you to comment. But also, as always, you can find this episode and the other episodes in Wave Rewind on our website. I'm Marissa Burke, signing off for this week's Wave Rewind.